Well, joining us on this edition of the News Review, we have author and commentator John Stepling. Joining us from Indore, Norway. Also, we have international human rights lawyer Edward Corrigan, who's joining us from London, Ontario. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. Let's start off with Mr. Stepling in Indore. Mr. Stepling, looking back at that fateful day, or days basically, in 1945, has the world, specifically the United States, moved in the right direction in the eradication of nuclear weapons? Yes or no?
I mean, it's interesting to talk about this now, 75 years on. You know, if there was no military reason for the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Truman knew that, but was sort of besotted with the idea of having this new weapon, and he wanted to intimidate Stalin, so the theory goes. But it's worth remembering that since then, the United States has threatened to use nuclear weapons a number of times. Johnson wanted to use them in Vietnam. Nixon wanted to use them in Vietnam. Dulles actually offered to sell nuclear weapons to France when it was losing in Vietnam. The French declined. The advisors to John Kennedy during the Cuban Missile Crisis advised using nuclear weapons. And it's rumored that the U.S. did use a tactical nuke in Afghanistan. One of its sort of bunker busters was, in fact, a sort of mini nuke. This is the only country that has ever used nuclear weapons. It's the only one that continues to threaten to use them. This side of perhaps Israel that threatened to use it during the Yom Kippur War, and Shimon Peres actually offered to sell nuclear weapons to apartheid South Africa. So Israel, the non-official nuclear state, also has a checkered record. But you know, the U.S. had already had an incendiary bombing raid of Tokyo in March of '45. There was the firebombing of Dresden. There were massive casualties to both those events. I think the horror that accompanied Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and it's kind of stunning when you think that 3 days after Hiroshima they did it again in Nagasaki, but they wanted to test. One was plutonium, one was uranium. There was different topography, and they were, you know, calculating the differences. But it's amazing. The horror that accompanied it was because this was a new weapon. It was shocking and horrifying, and there was a certain fascination with it that I think everyone had. It changed Western society, it changed world culture. From that day on, it ushered in an era of mushroom clouds and fallout and doomsday scenarios, and there still looms the threat of nuclear confrontation when anyone actually thinks about it. Remains horrifying. And of course Obama spent upwards of $1 trillion modernizing the U.S. nuclear arsenal, and one might kind of wonder why. It speaks to the madness of world leaders, frankly. To go back and really revisit Hiroshima and Nagasaki is a sobering experience.
Edward Corrigan, let's get your thoughts on the issue as well. The city's mayor, Hiroshima city mayor, has called on world leaders to move from nuclear deterrence to confidence-building dialogue. Are you seeing major powers actually moving towards nuclear deterrence?
Well, the world does seem to be stuck on building more and more nuclear weapons, and they're trying to bring tactical nukes, which are smaller nukes, but some of them are 6 times more powerful than the bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima. But the United States wants to spend money and it's expanding its nuclear deterrent, so to speak. But that forces China and Russia and other countries to respond. And the trouble is you can't use nuclear weapons, certainly the major ones, because if we use them in World War III, I think Einstein said that in the World War IV we'll be using sticks and stones. But the the bombing of Hiroshima was, as the earlier commentator said, not so much a message to Japan, it was a message to Stalin, because Stalin had a massive army and huge tank divisions which could overrun Western Europe. So the Americans wanted to send a message to Stalin that we have this weapon. The other interesting thing is that Hiroshima was not even a military target, had no military industry, nothing was there, even though the President Truman said that it was a military target. It was actually, the Americans did not bomb Hiroshima or Nagasaki because they wanted to see what would be the full effect of the atomic bombs that were dropped on the city. So they were held off and preserved until they would test these bombs. Japan at the time was already negotiating for a surrender, but as you know, the Americans wanted to test it, and it really was to send a message to the Soviet Union. And 140,000 civilians, incinerated. And actually, if you look at the long term, the people who died from radiation poisoning, stuff like that, probably is much more. In Nagasaki, 74,000. There was some military targets in Nagasaki, some industrial production. But again, it was to test a second type of bomb and to send a horrific message to the Soviet Union. The Japanese were on the verge of capitulation, and after the bomb, of course, they did surrender, unconditionally. But the United States and the military-industrial complex likes these big toys and wants to spend billions, if not trillions, of dollars on them, but they can't use them. And what's frightening is that they want to build these tactical nukes. They could use them in smaller, battles and to bomb cities and battlefields and stuff. But again, the radiation poisoning, the civilian deaths, the deaths even to our own troops. The Americans tested nuclear weapons in the desert, and they exposed their own soldiers to it just to see what the effect of the radiation would be. And many American soldiers died terrible deaths because of radiation poisoning. And this is a crazy way to spend money. You can't use them unless it's like, as they said, MAD, mutually assured destruction. So that's the deterrent role. But we can't use this, and the amount of money that's being spent on these weapons that really rationally can't be used is astonishing. And this money could be spent on other things, and solve the world's poverty problem or food shortages and many other things. And it's this obsession, largely driven by the Americans' desire to have bigger and better bombs, that is forcing the Russians and the Chinese and maybe even other countries to develop these weapons. And MacArthur, the General MacArthur in Korea, wanted to drop nuclear weapons on China during the Korean War because the Chinese, when the Americans showed up at the Chinese border, the Chinese forced the Americans back to the demilitarized zone. But fortunately, Truman, vetoed that and then fired MacArthur. But these weapons are horrific, and we should not be using them. And quite frankly, it's a huge waste of money that can't be used and rationalized. And this mad deterrence is not really a rational way to proceed, quite frankly.
Mr. Stepling, one quick question before we leave you. I think it's safe to say that the issue of nuclear deterrence right now, globally, it's nothing but a mirage. But what would be a step in the right direction?
Well, I mean, as your other commentator said, I mean, it's just insane. You can't use these things, and yet, gajillions of dollars are devoted to them. And over the last 3 administrations in the U.S., every single nuclear treaty has been torn up, and there seems to be no change to that in sight. Biden certainly isn't going to change. So we have now no non-proliferation treaty. We have nothing. And it bears mentioning that even today, 75 years after, perhaps the prime war crime in history, you will still read mainstream press justifying the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They will say, well, it saved American lives, it would have been protracted and blah, blah, blah. But Japan was on the verge of surrendering. They were finding a way to surrender that would save some face for the emperor, but it was, and all of Truman's admirals and generals told him this, in fact. None of them were in favor of using the bomb. They said there's no reason to do this, to bomb civilian cities. But Truman wanted to, later Dulles wanted to, as I said, Nixon, Johnson, all of these presidents have at different times warned, and every new president has to go through the initiation of saying, when asked by a journalist, what about nuclear weapons? Every option is on the table. Every president says this. It's like a rite of passage. America simply will not admit to the horror of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and they won't apologize, and I don't expect they ever will, frankly.
All right, thanks a lot, gentlemen. John Stepling, author and commentator, joining us from Indre, Norway. Also thanks to international human rights lawyer Edward Corrigan, speaking to us from London, Ontario. And with that, it brings us to an end here on this edition of the News Review, but do stay tuned. There's plenty more to come here on Press TV.